The Metropolis was an aging Civil War-era steamer turned passenger ship by the time she left Philadelphia and headed towards Brazil. She would never make it past the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and would leave many questions in her wake. The largest was, where should the blame fall?
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have The Rotting Metropolis Sparks Reform?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The men of the Jones Hill Life-Saving Station were alerted to a wreck on a sandbar about 100 yards from the beach around 10 in the morning of January 31st, 1878. The Outer Banks of North Carolina were treacherous, and the weather was foul. The captain of the life-saving crew asked if he should bring his boat, but he was told no by the fishermen, who had rushed on horseback to alert him. There was no time to drag the lifeboat out and make her ready. It was clear that the ship was already breaking up. The life-saving crew needed to be fast if they were going to save the lives of those on board. Though the people on shore did not know it, it had already been 2 hours since the ship had first grounded, and she was in rougher shape than they knew. The steamship Metropolis had started her life as an American Navy vessel bearing the name the Stars and Stripes in 1861. A wooden screw steam gunboat, she had started her career along the North Carolina Outer Banks, intercepting Southern blockade runners during the Civil War. Later, she had seen action off the coast of Florida and played an active role in coastal raids. With the Civil War's end, however, she became little more than an unneeded surplus vessel, and she was sold at auction into the civilian trade in August 1865. As the Stars and Stripes, she would continue to operate until 1871, when something strange would happen. Her owners surrendered her papers to New York, saying that she had been broken up. This would prove to be untrue, and perhaps a move intended to evade paperwork and undue scrutiny. Instead, the ship had been brought to a shipyard in Massachusetts and doubled in size, going from 407 tons to 878 tons. She was also given a temporary registration under a new name, the Metropolis. Though she was later permanently registered as the Metropolis in New York, her owners never seem to have disabused the state of the idea that the Stars and Stripes had been broken apart, something that was only true in the very loosest of senses. Though a certificate of seaworthiness for the ship post-expansion would later be looked for, it was never found. Only the name of the master carpenter who had worked on it. The newly expanded and renamed Metropolis would continue her activities carrying both passengers and cargo, but by 1878, she was starting to show her age. She was in a condition now where most companies would have relegated her to more local routes and coastal voyages, but that was not to be the fate of the Metropolis. Instead, her owners agreed to charter her to the Madeira and Mamoré Railway, operating out of Philadelphia. They were at the time building a railway through the jungles of Brazil, and they needed a ship that could carry not only the materials needed to build the railway, but also the workers to build it. Loaded down with a heavy cargo of railroad rails and machinery needed to build the railway, as well as 215 passengers, the Metropolis left Philadelphia in the morning on the 29th of January. By the morning of the 30th, the Metropolis was already beginning to show signs of distress. There was poor weather, and the rough waves caused the aging ship to start taking on water, the leak originating from the propeller well. the crew was called on to man the pumps, while the donkey engine was also put to work to try to manage the inflow of water. Realizing that the water was still increasing in the hold, and that his cargo of rails was now shifting dangerously, Captain Ankers did what he could to lighten the ship's load by ordering that coal begin to be thrown overboard. It was clear that the ship was not going to reach her destination, but Captain Ankers hoped that he would be able to make it to the port of Hampton Roads, Virginia. There, he would be able to assess the damages to his ship and his crew, and passengers would be safe. It might have been possible, as they were now off the coast of North Carolina, except that around midnight, the circulating pump stopped working. The ship now began taking on water much faster than before, and Hampton Roads was beginning to seem less and less likely. The final blow to this plan came in the form of a large wave that crashed down over the ship, taking with it the Metropolis's smokestack, lifeboats, and the doors from the forward saloon. The wave also extinguished the fires of the engine room and filled the ship's hold with even more water. The ship was now hardly manageable, and Captain Ankers did the only thing he could think of to save as many people as possible. He ordered that they should steer towards the beach, where at least there was a chance of a life-saving station seeing their plight and coming to help them. With heavy blowing snow now falling, the crew and passengers' life preservers were distributed. With lifeboats no longer an option, the men were told to look out for themselves the best they could. At 6:45 in the morning, the Metropolis found sand to rest on under the power of its sails, but it was not the beach that Captain Ankers had hoped for. Instead, it was a sandbar 100 yards from land. As the wreck had become imminent, many of the men on board had rushed to the deck, and now with the ship no longer moving, the waves that crashed over the decks of the ship smashed over them. People who were standing on the deck almost immediately found themselves being swept into the raging surf, which then pounded them into the shore. Some of them survived the experience. Many did not. Of those who did survive, many of them were in too rough shape to help anyone else. Meanwhile, on the ship, the waves crashing over the ship were disorienting, and loud enough that it was impossible for the captain to be heard any longer and bring any sort of order to the situation. As the ship began to show signs of breaking up, it seemed as though soon it really would be every man for himself. As is often the case with shipwrecks, especially on remote beaches, the first people to find it were 2 local fishermen who spotted the wreck around 8 that morning, as well as the people being washed in by the waves. One of them immediately rushed to go get help from the nearest life-saving station, while the other began the work of pulling as many people as he could from the waves. Now they just needed to wait for the professionals and their equipment to arrive. It would be a long wait. It was not until noon that the life-saving service would arrive with their gear and set to work. This was a matter of great discussion later, with allegations being made that the life-saving crew did not rush to the scene because they did not think anyone could survive in the harsh conditions. There is no evidence of this, however. Nor is there evidence that the life-saving station was neglectful in their duty by not spotting the wreck before the fishermen did. It came down to a problem of where the Metropolis had struck land. It was in between 2 life-saving stations, but with the 2 stations 12 miles apart, it was not close enough to either of them for a fast response. While one of the surfmen of the Jones Hill station had been on patrol through the night, due to the large amount of beach he had to walk, the last time he had been on the stretch of shore that the Metropolis had wrecked on had been 4:30 in the morning. With the weather conditions as poor as they were, he had not been able to see the distressed ship, which at that point was still at sea. Now that the Jones Hill Life Station was aware of the situation, station keeper Chappelle strapped on the medicine chest, while his crew of 6 followed him, hand-pulling the 1,000-pound beach cart full of equipment. They had a daunting 4.5-mile trek to make in terrible weather conditions. Every item in the cart was precious, however, if they wanted to be able to render aid. It included a mortar to fire a line to the ship with, along with the shot and lines to go with it, a breeches buoy apparatus, and a Merriman suit. Each of the men had also done their patrols in the last day as well, meaning that they were all already tired, as their patrols took them anywhere from 12 to 32 miles. A local man eventually came to their aid with his horse and cart, but the time had already been lost. Once they reached the wreck, the crew of the life-saving station immediately started setting up the mortar to get a line to the ship. While they were preparing this, the medicine chest was put to good use on those who had already been pulled up onto the beach. Once the mortar was set up, they got to work on the next step of their life-saving mission. The first shot missed, but the second shot landed the line across the fore-topsail yardam. Unfortunately, due to the shifting of the ship as it was breaking up, the line chafed and broke before the whip line could be pulled onto the Metropolis. Unfortunately, in his rush to reach the wreck as quickly as possible, Keeper Chappelle had failed to ensure that he had full charges, and he left with only half of what he needed. Though they had more balls and lines for the mortar, he only had the powder for 2 shots. One of the men who lived nearby provided some quick-burning black powder, but though it was attempted, it was not the correct powder for the mortar, and the line parted from the ball with each firing. The mortar was no longer an option, and the Metropolis was breaking up before their eyes. Out of desperation, Keeper Chappelle put on the Merriman suit, an early survival suit, and attempted to take the line out to the Metropolis himself. He made the attempt twice, and both times he was not able to get through the rough seas. The men on the Metropolis reached the realization that the only way that they were going to reach the shore was if they dove from the disintegrating ship and swam to shore themselves. For the next several hours, the life-saving crew stood in the surf, pulling men to safety, as both themselves and the men they were trying to save were battered by the timbers in the water that were coming from the ship. They were not completely without aid. At one point, a Newfoundland dog dove into the waves and saved a man who was drowning. Afterwards, the dog would become a de facto member of the life-saving service, joining them on their patrols along the beaches. No matter how hard the life-saving crew worked, however, they were not able to save everyone from the roaring waves, the cold weather, and the terrible undertow. In total, 85 people from the Metropolis died, either from being washed overboard or from attempting to reach the shore. Though 160 people were saved, the public would want answers for the heavy cost of life on a beach that was supposed to be under the protection of the life-saving service. The public outcry was harsh and immediate. All the worse because the USS Huron had wrecked only 30 miles away from where the Metropolis met her end only a few months before, also with a terrible cost of life. One paper of the era went so far as to speculate that the life-saving stations were in collaboration with wreckers, and were profiting from the ships that came to grief on their shores. There were certainly people on the shore who seemed less impacted by the horror of the wreck of the Metropolis, and more inclined to fill their pockets. As the bodies of the dead began to wash up on the beach, some of the people on shore took the chance to go through their pockets, taking what valuables they could find. As the ship broke up, trunks also washed ashore, and these too fell victim to looting on at least one occasion by one of the survivors of the wreck. Though there were those who were senseless to the suffering of the men who had washed onto their shore, there was also an outpouring of hospitality as people in the community took in the shipwrecked victims, many of whom had lost everything, even their shoes, in the wreck. It would be several days before ships could be dispatched to bring them back to Philadelphia. Captain Ankers would put the blame of the heavy death toll entirely on the negligence of the life-saving station, and he would voice his opinion to anyone who asked him. He was of the opinion that the entire operation had been botched, and no one would have had to die if the life-saving crew had responded as they should have. After a fashion, the crew of the Jones Hill Life Station agreed with him, though they did not consider it their fault. It was a matter of timing. They did not have a horse to pull the cart, and the stations were too far apart for a fast response, or for them to immediately notice if a ship was in danger. They felt that if they had been closer to the Metropolis when she wrecked, they would have been able to save everyone. Keeper Chappelle was dismissed from the life-saving service for his negligence in not checking his powder supply, but the public still demanded more. In the search for answers, Captain Merriman of the life-saving service headed to the wreck. Most of what remained of the ship was broken pieces of wood. She had been destroyed by the waves, but aided by decay. He found that the wood from the middle section of the ship, where she had been expanded, was in good condition, as was the wood that had been part of her cargo for the railway. The forward and aft sections of the wreck, however, were entirely rotten. He brought back pieces to prove it. The Metropolis had not had any business in rough seas with a heavy cargo. Others also went to look and agreed. Captain Gelman went out in his ship as well, with the intention of finding the leak that had initially caused the Metropolis distress. What he discovered after going waist-deep in the water to investigate was that the stern post was entirely rotten. He spoke up for the life stations, adding his voice to the ones that said that they were simply too far apart to have been any good. The United States government would eventually agree, and in March 1878, only a few short months after the Metropolis met her end, a bill was presented in the House of Representatives that would change the life-saving service for the better. 15 more stations were authorized to be built along the North Carolina and Virginia coast, where tragedy had so often struck. The keepers of those stations were granted with more powers, given a larger salary, and given money for equipment. Not only that, but the season that the stations would be manned was now clearly delineated, and the volunteer surfmen crews would be paid for every shipwreck that they worked as well as for training time. It did also call for investigations, however, where each shipwreck that ended with a loss of life in the jurisdiction of a life-saving station would be investigated to ensure no negligence on the part of the crews. Any crew that had failed in some respect would be dismissed, as was demonstrated with the dismissal of Keeper Chappelle for his failure to check his powder supply. The bill would pass with bipartisan support, and the life-saving service was now better equipped than ever to rescue anyone who met with danger, whether on the ocean or the Great Lakes. Slowly, it would grow until it would become part of the Coast Guard, which has continued with that duty to this day. For the Jones Hill Station, the great improvement to their efficiency and response time came in 1880, when they were able to gain a horse to pull the beach cart. For information on this story of the life-saving service, please see A Heavy Sea Running by Dennis R. Means from Prologue Magazine, Volume 19, Number 4 from Winter 1987, or our sources below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.